Hi, everyone. So many familiar faces. We all have been around a while, right? We're getting a lot of gray hairs here, some of us, me included. But anyway, good to see you all. We are going to talk through the Nursing Home Part A PPS Discharge Assessment. Before that, I want to address a question, and I know Mark alluded to the online question forum. The beauty of that is when you guys submit a question, we're receiving it real time back there. So it is going to greatly increase the likelihood of your question being researched and addressed. So I can't stress to you that that increases the efficiency of getting your questions asked. So if at any time you can use that, please take advantage of it. The question that we received was actually from an online viewer, and it asked about the dates when this information, this quality reporting began. And I know Sharon addressed in her presentation that for the fiscal year 2018 payment determination, that CMS is going to utilize the information that nursing homes collect for residents who are admitted to the SNF on or after October 1st, and then for residents who are discharged from the SNF up to and including December 31st, 2016. But as far as when the items are live, that's going to happen October 1st. The new item set goes into effect October 1st. The new data specs go into effect October 1st. So all of that is going to, whether or not that resident is taken into account for that actual APU determination is not going to affect whether that's live in the item set. I mean, it's just like other years when the item sets go live October 1st, the data sets associated with that go October 1st. So everybody good with that? And if you need further clarification, we certainly welcome those questions. I also want to mention the polling devices on your table. Throughout today's training, there'll be opportunities to work together at your table to come up with a consensus and an answer for a polling question, and then we'll ask that you submit that in as we go along. You're also going to have opportunities today to work together in groups on case studies. For this particular program that we're about to go through, there's only the polling questions. There are not any case studies, so you don't need any materials out of your packet, or for you folks who are participating online at home or in your offices, you don't need anything from that packet of information that says supporting materials. You only need the information from the presentation, so you don't need your folders for this. So for this module, before I begin, I really want to stress two important resources that you'll be using going forward, and that will be Chapter 2 in the RAI User's Manual is going to address information that we're going to talk about with this assessment, and also Section A of Chapter 3 in the RAI User's Manual will give information about the new items as well. And there is the draft manual that's been posted. You can expect that you'll hear some information today that's going to differ a bit, and that will appear in that final manual. So do be aware of that. We had some questions a few weeks ago that information presented differed a bit from the manual, and do keep in mind what's posted is a draft manual. The final is still to come. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and get started then. Here are your objectives for today's training. It's my hope that you all will be able to describe when the Nursing Home Part A Prospective Payment System, or PPS discharge, or NPE item set is indicated. We'll talk about principles for setting the ARD for this assessment, and that is really key part to our discussion, our time together this morning. We'll look at completion requirements for this NPE item set. So in other words, when does it need to be completed by and when does it need to be submitted by? We'll examine that. And then we'll talk about coding that new A0310H item, and that is this a Part A PPS or a PPS Part A discharge assessment? So currently we have our two types of assessments. We have two that are very well known to providers, and that's the discharge and return anticipated, and discharge return not anticipated. Beginning in October, we're going to have a third type of discharge assessment, and that is the Part A PPS discharge assessment. and that will be the focus of our brief time together here this morning. So I want to just review some basic information about the assessment type, and then we're really going to get into talking about the nuts and bolts of it. So our discharge assessment, this Part A PPS discharge assessment has been developed in order to inform quality reporting, to allow CMS to calculate the measures for the SNF Quality Reporting Program, or SNF QRP. In the assessment, there is clinical information as well as demographic and administrative information. And this is going to be completed when that resident's stay ends for Part A, but they remain in the facility. And if the individual is discharged from Part A, so their Medicare stay ends, but they remain in the facility for another day, you are required to do both a Part A PPS assessment and an OBRA assessment, but they can be combined. Okay, so in that case, they can be combined. And we'll talk a bit more about what happens when a resident is discharged and that day corresponds with the end of the PPS stay as well. So kind of where do the OBRA assessments come into play here? We'll talk more about that momentarily. Like our other discharge assessments, the ARD of a standalone PPS Part A discharge assessment is not set prospectively. It's always going to be equal to the date in A2400C, so the end date of their Medicare stay. And the ARD can be coded on the assessment anytime during the assessment period. And the assessment period for the assessment is the end of Medicare, as indicated in A2400C, plus 14 calendar days. And I mentioned this to you just a bit ago, that if the individual is, their Medicare stay ends on the day of, or the day before the OBRA discharge, both of these things are required but can be combined. And in this scenario, the OBRA, if you're combining that OBRA and PPS discharge, the ARD needs to equal the discharge date. So in this example, if on the first of the month Medicare ends and the person physically leaves the building or the nursing home on the second of the month, those assessments can be combined into the one, and the second of the month, which would be the date in A2000, will be the date that will be reflected for the ARD as well. Okay, so here we have a few opportunities to offer some additional insights, I think, that may be helpful. And further down, in particular, we'll talk about combination assessments that I think will be helpful as well. So as mentioned a moment ago, this assessment needs to be completed within 14 days after A2400C, the end date of the most recent Medicare stay. And it needs to be submitted within 14 days of completion, so Z0500B plus no more than 14 days. If a Part A stay ends and a resident is then subsequently placed back on Medicare, you'll do what you always do for those residents and begin their Part A, their Medicare assessments with a 5-day PPS. So nothing new with that. If the resident leaves the facility, an OBRA discharge assessment is required. And with this last bullet, you may be thinking, but wait, don't I need to then combine the OBRA discharge assessment with the Part A PPS assessment? And the simple answer to that is no, but the more complicated answer to that is the specs are actually set up where if you have the resident who has Part A and their Part A is ending, and you're doing an OBRA discharge assessment, that OBRA discharge assessment is force coding this item to be a Part A PPS discharge assessment as well. So section GG is going to be active in this. Okay, so it's actually the specs are set up that this is going to work it for you in a sense. Does that make sense? Guys, y'all with me? Yeah? Okay. All right. So I have a polling question for you. So if you would, I'm going to give you a minute or so once we review the question for you to talk amongst yourselves at your tables, and then I would ask that one person at each table respond to that poll. So when is a standalone Part A PPS discharge assessment required? Is it required when a resident leaves the facility for a leave of absence or an LOA? Or is it when a Medicare Part A, resident's Part A stay ends and they're remaining in the facility? When a resident goes to the emergency department? Or any time that resident is discharged from the facility? So go ahead and take a few seconds and talk amongst yourselves, come to consensus at your table if you would, and then use that clicker. Okay, I see quite a few responses, so I'm going to close the poll, and you guys are wide awake this morning and 100% right. But our polling question check is in the wrong spot. You guys are right. The correct answer is B, when the resident remains in the facility. Okay. Let's take a look now at the new MDS 3.0 item. And this is A0310H. Is this an SNF Part A discharge or end of stay assessment? So our coding instructions for this item are pretty simple. You'll code 0, no, if it is not a Part A PPS discharge assessment, and you'll code 1 for yes if it is. And here are some coding tips for your consideration. A standalone Part A PPS discharge assessment or NPE item set is required for the SNF QRP, and that is required when that resident's Medicare stay ends and they're remaining in the facility, and they're remaining in a certified bed in the facility as well. Keep in mind, if the resident's Part A stay ends and they're moving to a non-certified bed, what are you doing? OBRA discharge assessments, right? Because they're essentially moving out of that nursing facility. If a resident's receiving services under Part A, and they have that discharge date, so that's when they're physically leaving the facility, that occurs on the day of or the day after their end date of Medicare, then both assessments are required, but in this circumstance, they can be combined. When you're combining those assessments, the ARD of that OBRA and Part A PPS discharge assessment combined are going to be equal to the A0 or A2000 date, the discharge date that they actually leave the facility. So just to kind of rephrase that in another way, if you're conducting that combined assessment, in this circumstance, the ARD will be the same as that day, the physical discharge from the nursing home. And the A2400C date could be a day prior. Let's look a little bit at A2400C, and that is the end date of the most recent Medicare stay. So if an assessor answers 1 indicating yes to A2400A, that the resident has had a Medicare stay since the most recent entry or reentry, they're going to then enter the start date of that Medicare stay in A2400B, and then they'll enter the end date in this item. Let's take a look at a couple of the coding instructions related to this. Before we go through these, I just want to mention an important reminder, and that reminder is that this item, this group of items in A2400 only apply to those individuals whose stay is covered by traditional Medicare. We're not including HMOs in these items, or Medicare Advantage. So the end date is going to be whichever of the items listed here on the slide. occur the first. And those items are the date that the SNF benefit exhausts, in other words, their 100th day, the last covered day that is indicated on their notice of Medicare non-coverage, the last paid day if that's under Medicare if they're switching payer sources, or the date that they're discharged from the facility as reflected in a 2000 discharge date. If a Medicare stay is ongoing, this end date of Medicare will be dashed, indicating that the date has not yet occurred. And I'd also like to remind you that in the last page of Section A in Chapter 3, there is an algorithm in the RAI User's Manual that can be particularly helpful to folks who are new to coding this date, that really walks them through kind of a decision tree to help them in coding that item. So some other coding tips in the RAI User's Manual. Several of these are new or revised. Some of them are going to look very familiar to you, but let's take a look together here. The first coding tip is that the end date of the most recent Medicare stay, and that's as documented in A2400C, may be earlier than the actual discharge date, and if it occurs, that's when that Part A PPS discharge assessment's required. If a resident subsequently leaves the facility, you have to do that OBRA discharge, and in the case when they are days that are adjacent to each other, you can combine them. I see we have a question. I'm going to ask you to hold on to the end of the session, and we'll open up the mics and things for questions. And you can submit it as well, whichever works better. And again, I just mentioned to you that if they occur on the day of or the day after, these can be combined. So if the Medicare ends one day and the resident leaves the next, both are required. You can combine these assessments. And remember, if you're combining them, the ARD is going to be equal to the date that they're physically leaving your facility, as indicated in A2000. What about in the case of a resident passes away? A death and facility tracker is going to be completed for that. That's the only thing that's going to be required. In this case, a Part A PPS discharge is not required. And then for standalone Part A PPS discharge assessments, the end date of the most recent Medicare stay and the ARD are going to be the same. So for the standalone, the ARD equals A2400C, that date. And I'd like to ask you to take a look at a polling scenario. Our resident is Mrs. G, and she began receiving services under Medicare Part A on October 14th, 2016. She had a stable condition. She was able to manage her medications and her care that she needed. So the facility determined she's no longer receiving Medicare Part A. She was issued an ABN and a notice of Medicare non-coverage, but then she ended up going home the next day. So in this scenario, her Medicare ended on 11/23, and she ended up deciding to go home the very next day. So in this scenario, what type of discharge would be completed? Would we do a Part A PPS discharge assessment combined with an OBRA return anticipated? Would we do a Part A PPS discharge assessment combined with an OBRA discharge assessment return not anticipated? Or would we do a standalone Part A PPS discharge assessment or a standalone OBRA return not anticipated? So again, I'll ask you to talk amongst yourselves at your tables, come up with a polling response there, and give you just a few seconds to enter that polling. Looks like you guys 100% said the answer is B. But our check mark is in the wrong spot, and it says C. But you guys are right. I agree with you. My notes say B. So the Part A, I have a feeling we may have a technology glitch. But we'll get that straightened out. So let's just talk about why this is and kind of how we're going to be coding here. A0310F will be coded 10, discharge return not anticipated. Coding in G will be planned discharge. And then A0310H is going to be indicating that the individual has the SNF Part A discharge assessment. And our rationale for this is Mrs. G's last covered day under Medicare was 1 day before her physical discharge, so that combined assessment may be completed. And here's another polling scenario for you. Mrs. K began receiving services under Medicare Part A on October 4th, 2016. She was discharged from Part A on December 17th, and she and her family had already decided that she would remain in the facility long-term, and she was moved to a certified bed in a private room on the 18th. So what do you think for this polling question? What discharge assessment would be completed? Would it be that we didn't need to do a discharge at all? Is a Part A PPS discharge assessment needed? Is an OBRA discharge assessment return anticipated needed? Is the OBRA discharge return not anticipated needed? And take just a few seconds at your table and talk together about this item, and then we'll see how it goes. Debrief from that. So what do you guys think? Oh, what do you guys think? B is correct, and I'll leave it at that. The rationale for this is that Mrs. K's Medicare Part A stay ended, and she remained in the facility long-term. Therefore, that standalone Part A PPS discharge assessment's required. And I'd like to invite you now to take some time and work with Mrs. K's scenario a bit more. So I'm actually going to flip back to this scenario, so you have it up there. And then I don't know if you want to take a moment and maybe jot down any pertinent dates that you might need from that. And then I'm going to flip ahead to a group discussion opportunity for you. So maybe you want to jot down her start date of Medicare, her end of Medicare, and when she was actually moved within that facility. If you want to, whoever you've designated as your table's record keeper wants to jot down those points, I am going to move ahead to a scenario for you, or some questions for you. Okay, so I'm going to leave this slide up for about 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, while you guys work together at your tables, and then we'll come together and debrief. You will notice there's a couple of parentheses where it says no response is needed, so obviously you won't have to address that. But if you would just work together at your tables, and then we'll come back together and debrief from this scenario group discussion regarding Mrs. K. Okay? Okay. I think our conversation's moved on to planning where you're headed for dinner tonight, right? So rather, I'm going to guess that you guys are done, and we're ready to debrief, and that way we'll finish up in time for plenty of time for questions and answers as well. Okay, so what'd you come up with here for how would you code A0310F, like Frank? What do you think? Do you all agree? None of the above? She's still remaining in a certified bed, right? So there's no reason to do discharge reporting. How about, is this a Part A PPS discharge assessment? Yeah, it's going to be. So we'll code that as a 1. All right. And then we don't need a response for A2000 because she's not leaving the facility. How about for an ARD? What will we use for A2300 for her assessment reference date? Y'all agree? The day that her Medicare stay ended? Yep, great. And what are we putting in for A2400A, the start date of Medicare? 10/4, and ending 12/17. Great. Okay. And now let's spend the last couple minutes together talking about the how does this work with unscheduled assessments? And I think this is where we've had a fair amount of questions. This is definitely an answer that you'll have some revisions to the draft manual when that final is posted, so I would draw your attention to that as well. So let's look at a couple of special instructions related to the change of therapy OMRA. In cases where the last day of Medicare Part A, so the date that we're coding in A2400C, is prior to day 7 of the COT, no COT is required. So that's the rule you've been living with all along, right? No change. But how about if the date listed in A2400C is on or after day 7, then the COT would be required if all other conditions are met. So what are all other conditions are met? What does that mean? It means that nothing is changing with the COT requirements. In other words, all other conditions are met. If your patient is being discharged physically from your facility on day 7 and there's a change, do you need to do a COT OMRA? No. The PPS Part A discharge assessment does not change that. How about if the resident's Part A stay ends, day 7 of your COT period comes about, and there is a change, and they're staying? Do you need to do it? Yes. The Part A PPS assessment doesn't change that. So the rules for the COT march along just how you all have known them and implemented them. The bottom line is what this essentially means is the Part A PPS discharge assessment and whether or not you do a COT are not related to each other. However, if you need to do a COT or any other unscheduled Medicare Part A assessment, these assessments cannot be combined. So if you are required to do a COT based on the rules that you have known all along, and you say, oh wait, and Part A is ending, you have to do 2 separate assessments. And the reason for that is that the timing of assessment combinations or of events happening that would lead to this requirement was like 0.8 or 0.9%. I mean, it was minuscule. So the data sets weren't, and the data specifications weren't redefined to allow that assessment type to be combined. Okay, so that's the bottom line. So the bottom line is nothing changes with COT, right? It keeps marching along as you've known it all along. Everybody good? Good. And then the final point that's noted here is if the date listed in A2400C is day 7 of the COT, then again, the assessments need to be done. If you are required to do a COT based on all the COT rules that you already know, and you're required to do a PPS, you can't combine those assessments. Okay? All right. We saw a lot of head shaking that you're good with that, so great. And I think it's also, when the RAI manual comes out, you're going to see the coding tips in their entirety. I mean, we have excerpts of coding tips, right? We don't have the whole big page of coding tips. So I do think it makes it more in context when you're reading that whole section together, and I think that's an important point. So when you're combining the Medicare scheduled assessments with the Part A PPS discharge assessment, the ARD for A2300 needs to be set at the last day of Medicare, and the Part A assessment, remember, it's only scheduled PPS assessments, it's not unscheduled PPS assessments that you can combine, then it needs to fall within the appropriate type. So the same rules for combining assessments, the two need to match up. And do keep in mind that OBRA assessments can be combined with Part A PPS assessments as well. Okay, so you can combine those. The only thing you cannot do are those unscheduled assessments. So before we get to questions, let me just summarize that we're presented with this new Part A PPS discharge assessment, and the purpose of it is to collect the information for the SNF quality reporting program that's required under the Impact Act that Sharon described. And this is completed as a standalone assessment when the individual ends their Part A stay and they remain in the facility. And when the discharges when the resident discharges within 1 day of the end of Medicare, both are going to be, are required, but they may be combined in that instance. And with this, at this point, I'm going to open it to questions. We have about 9 minutes, so I do want to mention a couple of things about questions. If we don't get to everybody that's up within the 9 or so minutes, we do have a question and answer period for questions from the morning scheduled right after lunch as well, so we'll certainly take them. Go ahead.
When the...
let us know your name, where you're from.
Ellen Strong from Alabama.
Okay, hi.
I am asking, all right, if you have a SNF PPS discharge combining with a discharge from facility, so the ARD is within 1 day after, for Section GG, the 3-day look back, do you go with the ARD?
You go to the ARD.
So you're actually going to include 1 day that they're not, I mean, that last day that
Well,
they're not.
I want you to not think, I want you to hold on that question
Okay.
until we really conceptualize with Section GG, and that's coming up next. What are you really capturing in GG?
I know, but again,
No,
you're looking at a different 3-day period.
You're going to have a different 3 days, but I think it's going to become clearer to you when Ann talks a little more about what you're really trying to capture. I think it will help you focus on, essentially, with GG, you're trying to catch a baseline and you're trying to capture what is happening at the end of therapy.
Correct.
Well,
So again, it's not always therapy.
Right, but you're
Okay.
capturing the end of stay.
You're capturing end of stay,
Right.
but it could be that therapy discharged, on the first day
Sure.
of the look back, second day, or they were not
Right, so
involved
you're
at all.
capturing their status on discharge. So in that, you're going to use that 3 days. The ARD is, the rules for the ARD are the rules for the ARD. They end your assessment period.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Hey, Ron.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Just
This
a
is Ron Orth.
clarifying question, if you would, please. Everything says the PPS Part A discharge assessment is required when Medicare Part A stay ends and they remain in the facility.
Right.
So if my resident goes to the hospital today unexpectedly, I know I am doing, and they're admitted, so I'm doing a OBRA discharge assessment. Am I
Right.
not also coding that as a Part A discharge assessment?
The specs are going to address that for you, is my understanding on that.
So the specs are going to automatically code it as a yes?
I believe with a discharge, an unplanned discharge return anticipated, the unplanned items are going to be active. And we can verify it, but
My question is, what do we code AO310H? Is that a yes
I don't
or
think
a
you're
no?
going to have to code it. I believe it's going to skip. It's going to be force coded for you.
If you're doing an OBRA discharge,
Right, it force
yes.
codes that behind the scenes, so it makes GG open when it's required.
Well, I think part of the confusion, and there's a slide coming up under section GG, where it keeps talking about a PPS Part A discharge like section GG is required when you have a Part A PPS discharge assessment. So AO310G equals, AO310H equals a 1.
Right,
But then it talks about also AO310G must be planned. Well, if I'm doing a standalone Part A PPS discharge assessment, you don't answer AO310G because it's not a planned or unplanned discharge. That's the confusing part.
right. And if you're not answering whether it's a discharge, right? Entry, discharge, what type of discharge? So A310F,
AO310F.
you're not answering planned or unplanned, right? So in that case, you're answering H. Is it SNF Part A?
Right. Correct.
Right. Ron, it's going to force code it so GG becomes active when it's required.
Okay.
So based on whether it's discharge return anticipated, discharge return not anticipated, it's going to require items or not, including GG.
Well, okay, well, and when we get to the slide in GG, then I think that needs to be reworded because it talks about a Part A PPS discharge assessment. But if I'm doing a Part A PPS discharge assessment, I may not be coding planned or unplanned because they're not discharged.
Right, so
that's where I think that's confusing. It's if the OBRA discharge is planned or unplanned, not the Part A PPS
correct.
discharge.
It's a Part A PPS discharge, Section GG is active. And then Section GG is going to be active when there's a planned OBRA
Right.
discharge. And it is essentially coded as a Part A PPS assessment. You just don't have to do it. It's force coded in the specs.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So it's going to be grayed out probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Ron. Go ahead. Hi.
A simple clarification, Tammy Johnson. When I have a scheduled assessment combined with an unscheduled assessment overlapping a discharge,
You cannot put an unscheduled assessment with a Part A PPS discharge. They cannot be put together. So in other words, you have to do it separate in that scenario. Yep. Sorry, I know that's not the answer, but it happens so infrequently, that's why it was set up that way. Other questions? That's it? All right. Well, we have about few minutes ahead of schedule, but I'm going to thank you for your time and attention and turn this over to my colleague, Ann. So thanks so much, everybody.